Our guest today is Rabbi Mira Rivera. Rabbi Mira Rivera is the first Filipina-American woman to be ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary with an MA in Jewish Studies. Born in Michigan to immigrant parents from the Philippines, she grew up dancing and developed a love for the arts and a discipline for learning. Deeply rooted in meditation and community organizing, she brings an introspective approach to her practices while maintaining relationship building, collective power, and responsibility. Her experience of being an outsider in Jewish spaces brought her to the first cohort of the Jewish Women of Color Resilience Circle and Ben the Ark Stella Cohort 15 for Jews of Color. Since November of 2022, Rabbi Rivera has been the first rabbi in residence at the Lunar Collective, a Gen Z founded organization by and for Asian American Jews. In February of 2023, she joined the JCC of Harlem as their rabbi in residence with a mission of community outreach and growing an in-person, beloved community that is truly welcoming to those who have been on the margins. I welcome to Detours and Destinations my friend and colleague Rabbi Mira Rivera. Welcome, Mira.
Thank you so much. Rabbi David, Rav, David, all of the above.
Well, we know each other in many contexts, which we'll get to.
Mm-hmm.
We've worked together at the community that I founded in Romamu. But this podcast is about journeys of remarkable people and about the ways in which, our journeys have all kinds of interesting, detours and stops along the way, and how there isn't really a straight path for the most part. And so I think you're someone that I think of immediately as someone has a remarkable story to tell and a remarkable journey to this moment, to this destination. So I want to begin with, I want our listeners to get to know you and who you are and some of your story. Can you just take me from where you are today, rabbi, a leader in the Jewish community, the first Filipina American to be ordained by the venerated institution, the Jewish Theological Seminary, the flagship training ground for conservative rabbis in America. Take me from this destination that you've arrived at back to some of the detours and some of the early places in your life. You have a very interesting and colorful story. Yes.
So I'm going to pick up in my first experience of concerted spiritual life, meaning waking up, doing ablutions, bath, and then being in a group amongst women. We were all meditators, and we were in India. And we had come from different countries. So this was Varanasi. And one of my really seminal moments there at that time there was a time I was studying. We had to study these shlokas. Shlokas are like verses in Sanskrit. And you just counted. You just checked how many you master. And I remembered I was sitting in a little shade on the mirpeset, on the balcony of this home, a second floor home in Sigra, Varanasi. Very genteel section of Varanasi, very far from the burning ghats, right?
How did you get to Varanasi?
I was following a teacher, and I was
And
really
how old
drawn.
are you at this time?
This was pretty much straight out of high school.
So out of high school, spiritual seeker.
Yeah, I was a spiritual seeker, and I was in the Philippines, going to school there. And but it was martial law, and really I was illegal. I was undocumented in the Philippines. I had a tourist visa, and I wanted to continue going to school, but they said, no, you can't. You have to leave. And so I went back to the United States, but then I was really on this seeking path, and so I ended up in Varanasi. So anyway, there I was on a balcony, going through probably maybe number 70 of these verses that I had to memorize. And I remembered sitting there in the shade, what white hot sun, but I had this little shade. And I said to myself, if I could only spend my life learning verse after verse of these elevating, like haikus in Sanskrit on spiritual life, I would be a happy person. And then I remember then, would that be possible? When I think about now and, the time, the hours of spending learning verse, learning Torah, so I could learn, so I could chant, I got my wish, where I have my whole life ahead of me. And I always say, if I have to run, what am I going to grab from the house before I run? Because we have to pack up and go. Our kids already not in the house, but my spouse, my passport, and my tikkun.
And your tikkun, the book
Yeah,
that
my
you used to
tikkun, and
learn
yeah,
how to read
right.
the Torah from
Yeah.
the original.
And then if I have to run, that's what I'm going to run with, and my guitar.
I asked you about your story, and you
Yeah.
start as a spiritual seeker. And
Yes,
is that like
very
such a
early.
core part of how you remember yourself from a
Such a
very
core
early
part from
age?
an early age. And I think it really is because I didn't grow up with my parents. It was very strange.
So tell us about that. You didn't
Yeah,
grow up
so
with
I
your
was born in
parents.
the United States. My parents came here at different times in their lives. My dad first, and he was so much older than my mom. And then, he met my mom, and my
Where they
mom,
meet?
they met in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
My mom, she was already a new doctor of medicine, and she was sent to do a public health MA. But she fell in love with Washington, D.C., and the nation's capital, and she wanted to stay. And her friends at the Philippine consulate said, "You can't just stay.
Mm.
Either you have to get married." And so, anyway, she met my dad. It was like a shidduch. It was you know,
An
a
arranged
pairing. Yeah, yeah.
pairing. Use the Hebrew shidduch or
Yes,
the Yiddish,
a
which is like an
pairing.
arranged pairing. Yeah.
Somebody knew my dad, and my dad had come from the Philippines, but he already had an American passport. He was a naturalized American, and they hit it off, and so there I was. I was born. So like, that was the beginning, but my mom, I guess, was not so secure in being in the United States, and she felt that I would be the only child because they were both advanced in age, and it was a
How old
miracle.
were they?
By the time my dad was probably in his 60s or
Okay.
more, and my mom was, women's reproductive life, she was pushing it late, but I was the miracle baby. And my grandma, her mom, had come for my birth. And after a while, they decided that the best thing for me to grow up in surrounded by a lot of cousins and relatives and that kind of community
Like a
help,
village.
like a village, precisely like we had a family compound. Their idea was it would be best for me to go to the Philippines with my mom's mom
Hmm.
and be raised in that environment because there would be cousins and there was land and we could run around. And I guess they were thinking of otherwise I would grow up to be like a latchkey kid.
Right. So from an early age, you're already a community organizer.
Yes.
So
So
they were organizing community
they
for
sent
you,
me, yeah, they
and they
sent
want you to be
me,
a part of a
yeah,
broader community, not just alone here in the United States
right.
with them.
And
And they decided not to go back. They stayed here.
they stayed here. And now that I've worked, on issues like immigration, I hear stories like
Like
that,
this one.
right? Like some people would say, "Oh, how can these immigrants be so heartless and send their children to back home?" But it happens, it really happens. And there's this belief, this understanding that the elders will take care of the family.
So you were here as an American citizen. You were born here,
I was born here.
and then you go back with your
I,
grandmother
and
to
so
the
to the
Philippines.
Philippines. And I think my first memory really, I was like 2.5 years old. My first memory, I remember this really vividly, was lot of mosquitoes and flies. They said I would just scream. I would scream. I was traumatized by the mosquitoes that would bite, and the flies that were just everywhere. And the heat, maybe I don't remember, but
It was
it
dislocation
was
for you, for sure.
it was such a dislocation for me.
So it's kind of like a first detour of sorts.
Yes,
like
very.
you were
I was
born in,
so
and all of a sudden you're in the Philippines. And when did you realize? I mean, we're talking about your spiritual
yes.
seeking, and also, of course, pivoting towards your career as
Eventually,
a dancer. So when did those things begin to
oh
emerge
my
for you?
gosh. So my uncle, my aunt, my grandma, they sent me to a Catholic school, and I remember like Wednesday mornings, we would be brought to the chapel, and we would kneel because those were the prayers. The prayers were kneeling, and they would do this ceremony with incense, kind of like golden perforated vessels like this with incense inside, and they would like swing it front and back. And the position of looking up was already part of my life then. And they would be singing, and there were nuns. There was a convent in that school. And I would see these nuns, and some of them were our teachers, but they would file out, and there was a certain grace and a certain gravitas about them. And so
Mm.
being in that was already like very elevating for me.
Already, like listening to the story, and of course, I said this earlier, but I haven't addressed it. Like, you and I are colleagues. We've known each other for quite a while, and I know you and I know your family. But one of the things that I know about you, which we haven't yet fully touched, is your career as a dancer and your seeking, which we're about to talk about. But already from this story, Mira, I can already see the embodiment of spirituality, the way that your body moved to open right in this
Completely.
way, and that you
Completely.
were and music, like these are the themes of your life, which are embodiment, spirituality, and a sense of, I guess, devotion or
Mhm.
connection and longing in that way. So that's a bit of the earliest place of your spirituality. When did dance happen?
Well, it was a particular school where every time the nuns would have a birthday, right? Any of the principals or a music director, actually at that time, he was like the premier music director in the Philippines, would write a special song to that nun, to that teacher. And so there was always music and there was always changing music, new music we were learning all the time. And twice a year, there would be these events where every grade would present a folk dance. And then the next half of the year, it's either the Glee Club, and there was always an orchestra of Philippine instruments, well, Spanish Filipino instruments.
Okay.
And they called it the rondalia. And so I was just surrounded by all of this music and dance. And so we learned like Philippine folk dances. So every grade, I would have a different costume. We would learn this particular piece. So there was always, it was right there all the time.
And were you talented, or was it like clear that you had a talent or an aptitude for
You
movement and
know,
dance, and
yes, and I was happiest.
you were most
I
alive?
would be most alive. And I remembered my other cousins, they were sent to another Catholic school. They didn't have as much of that. And we became just two different
Mm.
beings.
So you brought us to Varanasi after
Yeah,
high school,
right.
right? So it was a police state. You said you were living in the
Yeah.
Philippines. We could spend quite a bit of time on that.
Even just that.
And we just like,
Yeah.
that's just intense.
Yeah.
And so you make your way to Varanasi, and you're drawn to, after a teacher,
Right.
and you're learning these verses, and you're really, what we'd say, a sannyasi, and you're like really about to.
That's exactly what I was.
You were.
I was following the sannyasi path.
Can you say a bit more about what, for listeners, what sannyasa
I guess
is?
sannyasi is like there were different ways that a woman could be in India. A householder, a family person, so children, spouse, and
Domestic.
yes, situated in society. And then when a woman loses the spouse, then they could choose the path of sannyas, right?
Almost like a renunciate.
With
Like you can,
yes,
you renounce.
of renouncing the world and going into a kind of a, I guess, a convent of sorts or an ashram, a place where life is organized according to prayer, to meditation, some kind of physical service, and then preparing of meals together, eating communally, and again meditation and study. So I was happiest. If there was any other place I was happiest, that's where I was
Almost
happiest.
like the nuns back, like
Exactly.
very much like connect,
Yeah.
like that was, you wanted to be that
That person.
connected to something
Yeah.
intense and pure and
Yeah.
right.
But I remembered, like in second grade, my favorite teacher was this teacher named Sister Flor
Uh-huh.
Encarnacion. And she was dynamite. She was so vivid and just like such a personality. Then we heard at the end of the school year that she was going to be a missionary to Africa. And I remember thinking, like, I want so much to do that. So somehow I found my place in Varanasi amongst this group of seekers that would be sent to different parts of the world to do like that kind of work.
So were you sent?
Yeah, I was sent.
Where were you sent?
I was sent to Singapore was the first place, and then eventually to Europe, and then a little bit in South America.
Wow.
And I did such good work. And I guess I was brave. I had my guitar in my back,
Wow.
that when I was in South America, the master teacher had come and they said, there is an opening in the Middle East. And we need a woman teacher to be there. And I remembered like I was sitting and in the back I just like started to sink like this because like do not, please do not pick
Do
me.
not choose you.
Do
You,
not
you
choose
didn't
me.
want to go.
I didn't want to go because I'd heard that anyone who was sent to the Middle East eventually left the path.
Huh.
Like it was so hard, life was so hard that eventually they just like surrendered
And you didn't want
went
to
home.
leave, so you
I
thought,
never wanted to leave.
I don't want to go to the Middle East because I
I
might wind up leaving.
exactly, and of course
You were
they
chosen.
go like this and they said pick her, and really it was during that time I was such a good soldier even then. I would always do my work and find people to teach. And so one day I said, I'm in Jerusalem. Maybe you should see Jerusalem, right? This is like the heart of spiritual life in the Middle East. And so I said, okay, maybe I'll go to the Mount of Olives first. I'm kind of like, I don't really know where to go.
You don't even know where to go, but you
Yes,
know about the Mount of Olives
exactly.
and you're going
Mount
to
of
go
Olives,
there.
let me go. So the bus went up, and I thought, oh, maybe I'll find a garden there, because I saw on the map the Garden of Gethsemane. Maybe I'll go there and be there around the time of afternoon, evening meditation, like Ma'ariv, I could sit down, do my meditation. But no, the bus took me all the way up, and at that time there was an Intercontinental Hotel up there,
Okay.
and then there was a cemetery up there on the top of Mount of Olives. And so I said, okay, let me walk. Little did I know that I was walking in that, where there were like sages,
Jewish sages.
Jewish sages. I found a spot. I did my meditation. And when I was done, I opened my eyes. I didn't realize that where I had sat, there was the dome of the rock there, and the sunlight was just hitting, and everything was golden. Like the
Wow.
walls were golden. And I said to myself, Mira, you have to go into the old city tomorrow. Like, just do it, go. And I was living in a predominantly Christian country. So when I think of the old city, like, what do I know? So I thought, well, there's this thing called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
Yeah.
I went and I was like ejected out of the place. I felt like I self-ejected because it was a tourist place. I said, no, this is not a holy place for me.
Right. Very Disney.
Yes. And the only other place that I knew was like, oh, there was Via Dolorosa. Let me follow that. And so I started walking down. And as I hit the bottom, there was the shuk, there was the market. Right. In those days, there were no guards, right, at the bottom. So I hit the bottom, and then I exited, and then suddenly I was out into the kotel.
Into the courtyard in front of the
courtyard,
Western
like
Wall.
The Western Wall.
The holiest site in the Jewish tradition, yeah.
And it was afternoon, and the sun, and everything. I just saw this, and I just was like, it was like my heart was just like this. And I just literally, I remember thinking, I so want to just, embrace this, just go to the wall and just embrace the wall. But I saw, I had been living a spiritually ordered life, and I saw men on one side, women on one side.
And that wasn't foreign to you because in that tradition,
not foreign
men and
to
women
me.
were separate.
But I thought that there's this divider. I said to myself, it is not for you to go up to the wall, although that was what I wanted to do. But for you, you can maybe find a place to sit along the wall. And in those days, the chairs were up against the wall. The Western wall.
The divider between the men's section and the women's section.
Yes.
There were chairs there.
And the chairs were there. And I remember I found one, and I just sat. And what I know was to meditate. So I closed my eyes in meditation, and I just I felt like a hand was coming out of the wall and just pulling me. And so to contain my excitement and just this tremulous feeling, I sat down, I meditated, and then just these tears just kept flowing, just like a river of tears coming. And I just cried and cried until there were no more. And when I had this feeling like everything had just come out of me, and suddenly I felt this deep, deep peace, just all the striving, all of the, mission making, just all calmed down. And I felt like I was home.
You felt at that moment like you were home. You had arrived.
I had arrived.
By way of walking to Via Dolorosa, and you wind up at this destination, which you didn't know was a destination.
Yeah.
It kind of happened accidentally.
Yeah.
And you realize you're home. So what did that lead to, that arrival?
I remember the first thing I thought was, what does it mean? Because I recognized what I had gone through as, a kind of like an opening.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't frightened of what I had just experienced. So I said, what does this mean? Should I stay in Israel, go to kibbutz? Because, I'd heard about that. Should I now leave? Exactly like all of these things I had heard, people who get sent to the Middle East from amongst these meditators would leave.
Mm-hmm.
And then I suddenly, instead of almost like this adventure seeking, what came, it's almost like a calming realization was, no, you have to go home. Go back home to your worldly home.
Yeah.
Where my family was, where my mother was,
Mm.
and find healing. Find healing with her.
Mm.
Find healing with the rupture that somehow this family of immigrants had gone through.
So that brought you back to the States.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And eventually I left. Of course, I'm exactly the same person that I didn't just like disappear. I went back to India, went back to my teachers and said, I'm going to go. They said, why? And I said, I have to go. I have to leave. I have to seek this,
this healing.
This healing.
And was that the beginning also of the deep Jewish journey for you?
Yes. I knew from that point on I was going to read. And exactly what happened was I started reading everything I could
about Judaism. Wow. So that set you onto a Jewish path.
Yes.
And so you come back to the States.
I came back to the States and
where does Martha Graham show up?
Okay, so my mom was, and I knocked at the door and she really did not raise me. So what is she going to do with this young woman, And so I said, okay, she can't really handle having a daughter showing up. So
you showed up to do healing, but maybe she wasn't ready for that. And
exactly.
So
I knew I had to like go
on your own way.
And the Sanskrit word we had was like, I needed to find my place in a Lokik world, in this kind of this world with all
form
of its
and
form,
messiness.
Right, exactly. And so, I thought, okay, I'll go to school. I knew somebody who was all the way in San Diego, and that there would be like a kind of an ashram there I could possibly like live in and then go to school. And that's what I did. So as far away from the East Coast where my mom was, I went all the way in like
to the West
corner.
Coast.
Yeah. And while I was there, I knew dance. Like I had known dance. And so, I was in college and I started dancing with the company. And then I heard that the Martha Graham Company was coming.
To San Diego, to the West Coast.
And the West Coast. And, why the Graham Company was somehow like when I was in the Middle East, I found myself in Amman and when I was teaching, going back and forth. And
so you're in Amman, Jordan.
Yeah, I was in Amman, Jordan. And I went, I was in the cultural center, the American Cultural Center, because I said, okay, take advantage of what they have here. And they were going to show, I think, The Godfather or something like that. So I said, okay, I'll go see The Godfather, an offering to the expat community. And while I was waiting at the table, there was this coffee table book of Barbara Morgan, the photographer, on Martha Graham's piece called Letters to the World. And the front cover was her, like kind of like cantilevered, her body parallel to the ground and her skirt all the way up and like this kind of like reaching down like this. And I said to myself, that looks like prayer. Can you pray in movement?
Can movement be prayer?
That looks to me like prayer.
Wow.
That looks to me like this devotion, this life that I was leading.
Pointing towards the ground
exactly,
also. Pointing towards back towards the...
Exactly. And also during that time when I was in Israel, it was summer and there was dance. And so, I dared even think, can I dance? Can I dance? And I was able to, like slowly.
So they came, and so Martha Graham comes to the West Coast, and
they came to the West Coast, and it so happened that the dance company I was performing for, they were all friends. They were all friends, and so I was an apprentice, and I remembered I told one of the men, I said, I want to do that.
Wow.
And then he said, well, I want to do Ailey. He said, I'm going to Ailey. He said, I'm going to go to New York and try out for the Alvin Ailey Company. And then he said, you come, right? Let me get settled, and then you come.
And then you come.
So it was very clear to me, I did my exams and everything, and then I came. And it was just a right time, one of those right times.
And so you start dancing for Graham.
Right.
So from the Philippines
Yes.
to Varanasi
Yeah.
to the Middle East
Yeah.
to now dancing with
Yeah.
maybe one of the most
Yes.
well-known and venerated and respected and brilliant and cutting-edge
Right.
modern dance
Yes.
companies. And now here you are in New York.
And I was in New York.
And you wind up
Yeah.
dancing for them for how many years did you dance for the Graham Company?
Oh, so maybe about really 5 years,
Wow.
first in the school and the second company, the apprenticeship, and just being in that world with Yuriko Kikuchi. Like she saw me and she like really developed me as a dancer, and she was like my mom. And in my ballet world, my other mom was Gabriela Taub Darvash, she's Jewish, but there was a Jewish choreographer in the Martha Graham world. Her name was Pearl Lang. And she was doing these pieces called Tehillim,
Yes.
Sephardi women. So
Wow.
brazen me, I went up to her, I said, Ms. Lang, may I dance for your company? And she said, oh, no, dear.
Why?
She said, no, this is not for you. That's what she said.
Just like that.
She said, you're like a noodle. In those days, I was like a noodle. Anyway, that's what she said. You're like a little noodle. But somehow, even though she said no, we developed a relationship. And I would do choreography class with her because it was a requirement. And every day it would be different. I would do something. She would see what I'm doing. She said, dear, what are you doing? She come here. What are you doing? The homework is to do an anger study. An anger study. That's what you have to choreograph. And so I said, Miss Lang, I can't get angry because that's
wow.
too dangerous,
Wow.
And I remember that she looked back like that and she said, okay, what moves you? If you can't go into anger, what moves you? And so I told her about being at the hotel.
Okay.
And then she said, tell me about it. So I told her, and she said, you dance about that.
Huh. Wow. She tapped into a living vein for you, something alive, dynamic.
She really did.
Right? You couldn't access your anger, but because you're a dancer, you have to have passion and connect to something alive in you.
Yeah.
And when she directed you to find aliveness,
Yeah.
you were brought back to that moment where you were sitting on the chair on the divider between the men's section and the women's section, and you felt a hand pull your heart.
Yeah.
And you were home.
Yes.
And she said, dance that. So you danced that.
Exactly.
Amazing.
Exactly.
So again, wow. So this becomes almost follow your passion, follow your heart.
Right. And then eventually she would tell me, write everything that you remember about being in Israel and in Jerusalem and all that was being awakened. And she said, write everything down. So I started writing, and our paths would cross. But I was also dancing, for Graham. I mean, we did anger studies all the time. I mean, Graham was like totally about, all those heavy emotions. But for me to tap into my own narrative of anger was too dangerous.
Why was it like?
Because I felt like I would fall apart.
You'd fall apart.
I would fall apart.
And did you have anger? Was it
completely?
Yeah, completely.
Of course, I was
from your from
mom,
and from leaving,
and martial law and gross inequality and experiences I had also in Lebanon, Amman, all that part of the world. I thought that I would just completely fall apart. But dance gave me a place to lift all that up, to lift all that up. And when I would dance, like on stage, when they would say, look up, I would say, of course I will look up. That was the way. They would say, okay, focus on that exit sign up there and on the balcony. For me, I was focusing on God, on the divine. And all that in so many ways, that was my saving grace.
So your God, like your
Always.
God positioning system, your GPS.
That was my.
You were finding your coordinates. You were like things were pulling you
all the time,
and almost like the breadcrumbs, were leading you home again, another home, but a new home.
Yeah.
And so accessing your anger, your embodiment, your story, and also being able to look up and hold those things.
Yes.
And from this experience in the world of dance and a deep immersion, like you don't do it. I mean, clearly you don't do things like as a hobby.
No.
Like you were like learning Sanskrit verses, and you were like, one day I'm going to learn Torah verses.
Right.
So you're there, and you're exploring your Jewish roots or the Jewish vision that you had, and you meet your husband, as
Yes,
he's a pianist or he's a musician.
so he was a musician, musicians who were able to improvise. A lot of them found careers in modern dance classes. So there
Right.
was Alvin Ailey and there was Martha Graham
Like
School. And
they were just doing that work.
a friend said, one of the pianists told Jerome Corman, hey, I'm doing a concert and with other musicians at the end of a summer intensive. We want to show them this other music that we do. We don't just do
Right.
what they hear in class. And so he said, sure, and so I met my future husband there.
And Jerry and you meet your husband, whose father is a Holocaust survivor, whose family comes from Germany.
Yes. So
and now you're brought into
his world.
Into his world and into more Jewish life. And
yeah. So the first concert. So I met him at that concert, and then that evening we all went out, and then I remembered thinking, is he Jewish? Maybe he's Jewish. You know what? If he's not, I'm going to prepare myself. So I asked him, I said, Jerry, are you Italian? And then he said, Corman. My last name's Corman. I'm Jewish. And I said, I remember my first thing out of my mouth was, can you tell me all about it?
Because you were so curious.
I just said, can you tell me all about it?
Like my Rabbi would call that psycho-Semitic. You were like, there was something, not psychosomatic, but psycho-Semitic. You were drawn to this.
I
Jewish
was drawn,
root.
and I said, can you tell me? And then he said, oh no, he said, my dad is a president of a shul, but I'm not really of a synagogue. I'm not really,
I'm not that affiliated.
Yeah,
right.
And then, but we became really good friends, and eventually we started dating. And his mom welcomed me, invited me over for Shabbat and all this. And his dad was a little bit more circumspect about the whole thing, but we dated and dated and dated again. Like year went into another until we just said, what are we doing? And so I said, I want to convert. And he said, oh dear, you don't need to do that,
Oh,
but
wow.
I said, I do, I said, but he knew my story, but
that you were
really.
That when you go all in.
Yeah.
And you're like, I'm going to convert. I'm going
to. I said, we have to raise a family, and I would like to raise a family Jewishly.
So I want to pivot here because I really want to. So you convert, and you become a part of a very, very dynamic and big Jewish community on the Upper West Side of Manhattan called B'nai Jeshurun. And you raise your two children, right? You have Ariel, who's in rabbinical school now and a musician, and Ben is also a musician and a remarkable young man. Yeah. And so your family grows up in the heart of the Upper West Side, very Jewish. You're not on the rabbinical path yet. You're just in the back of your mind.
Looking.
Yeah, you were looking.
I was always looking. And
how was it like to be as a part of that community? Was it welcoming? Did you find yourself in the Jewish community feeling like you were on the outside, the inside, somewhere, metza, like?
I remember during my conversion, right? I came out of the mikvah, of the waters, and I was sitting for my Beit Din, my interview, and wet from the mikvah, from the waters,
immersion waters,
yeah. And tears, all the same, all mixed. And then the rabbi said, even with what you feel, the fervor that you feel, you will not be easily accepted by the Jewish community. And I remember thinking whoa, you have my attention now. Then he said, you have to find a niche in the community. And I heard that loud and clear. I said, got it. And somehow Jerry and I really just said, hey, what can we do? We are both musicians. At that time I was more into dance, but we were both musicians. This is something we can do for the community.
Which is what? To create?
They used instruments during services, and we said, we can do this.
So you became part of
immediately.
The worship team, part of that community?
Immediately. So children's and young people's services, right off the bat, we were accompanying, we were in the tefillah community.
Wow, you're in the prayer community. When did the idea that I am now going to go from Varanasi and the Western Wall to the Upper West Side, institution of higher learning, JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary. When did that?
It took a while, but I always would look at the rabbis from where I was and just look at it just with a lot of appreciation, and also noting differences in the way I led my life before, and seeing how they moved and taught. That's why I say that my first teacher was Marshall Meyer, Rabbi Marshall Meyer of blessed memory. I watched like a hawk, and I just like opened my heart to what he was saying and what the other rabbis were saying. But really, it was, I was becoming one of the Torah readers for junior congregation. And there was one time I had just read, and people were coming to congratulate me and saying that was so wonderful and all this. And one woman said, Mira, when are you going to go to rabbinical school? Right. I started hearing this
Oh, that's
because I
great.
was a regular reader.
That's great.
And then I thought, I'm hearing you, And then she
She's
said,
dropping a seed,
yeah.
and you're
And then
hearing
she
it.
said, oh, by the way, our eldest daughter, Sophie, just decided she's going to go to Heschel, to the Heschel High School, like a Jewish day school. And I remember thinking, if Sophie has the guts to really pivot after being in secular public school and to go to high school
Yeah.
and has the courage to do that, I'm going to take the courage.
Well, it's like the story in the
Yeah.
Talmud that you and I
Yeah.
both know about, the great sage of the first and second century in Palestine, Rabbi Akiba, who didn't begin his rabbinic studies until he was 40,
Yeah.
right? And he was sitting in the back, as it were, in the folklore. He was sitting with the children and being inspired by their learning, and he remained open to being a student.
Right.
Like many people are kind of done at that point in their lives. They're not pivoting and thinking, okay, I'm ready for another challenge, another mountain to climb, another journey, another landscape. You had so accomplished in your career, and here you were going to become what we know as beginner's mind in Zen
Right.
tradition. You were going to become a beginner again,
Right.
with all of its inadequacies and excitement, and also the vulnerability. You mentioned Rabbi Marshall Meyer, and for those who don't know who he was a remarkable rabbi here in the United States who helped revitalize the B'nai Jeshurun community that you joined on the Upper West Side. One of his distinguishing features as a rabbi was his involvement in social justice. He was very much a student of Abraham Joshua Heschel, very much a student of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., all of these remarkable leaders whose spiritual fervor led them into seva, into service, into trying to make the world a better place. Was it clear to you that as you thought about going back to becoming a religious leader, a rabbi, that such a central part of your rabbinate would be not the bliss of the Wailing Wall, but like the messy, like making the world a better place, diversity, equity, inclusivity, the plight of marginalized peoples and marginalized Jews? Was that already a part of your identity as well?
The fact that Rabbi Marshall Meyer did a lot of his rabbinate and revitalized also like Buenos Aires
Right.
during the coup, during the golpes, like all of that, like
He was arrested. He was very
really spoke to me because I know that life and I had been in South America, right? So I would imagine, I would have my other world of imagination, like I know what they came from. I'd served also in South America, but this idea, you and I talked about this a lot, and you're the only rabbi I know who would use the word seva. And for me, seva, service, was really at the core of my being. So my entry point into the Jewish world would be this rabbi who was involved in this kind of work, but still somehow was able to create a community that aspired to the depths of prayer and tefillah.
Right.
Was for me, it was just a through line.
So I just want to condense slightly.
Yeah.
So from that moment, you enter into this, rabbinical school. You begin this
Rigorous,
and arduous journey towards becoming becoming a rabbi, ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary. You become adept at not just reading Sanskrit as you once could, but now reading Aramaic and reading Hebrew and leading prayers, your musicality, and just your devotional aspect together with your social justice bend. You come out of rabbinical school and you came to work at Romamu as a fellow, as what we call the Jewish Immersion Network. And that's when it's not the first time we met, but then you and I were colleagues. We were working at the Romamu community that I started. One of the things that you used to say frequently to me was, at Romamu, and I don't know if it's only Romamu, I'm not trying to do an advertisement for my community, but one of the unique features of Romamu was that my path also included some Eastern elements and the places where Buddhism and Hinduism and some of the other things had come together with devotional Jewish prayer and meditation and contemplation. and a love of, right, a love of study and so on. So you used to say that felt like the most aligned for you. And one of my highlights, and just for those who are listening and who will be watching, one of the highlights for me was during the pandemic when you were working at the Romumu community, and we had our first high holidays in the pandemic in 2020, and we did it outdoors. And we asked you to do something I don't think that has ever been done. I've never seen it done in any other space. We asked you to dance. We commissioned you to dance the Haftorah, which is the prophetic reading on the morning of Rosh Hashanah. It happened to also be in the morning where Ruth Bader Ginsburg had passed away. We found out the night before. And so that morning, during the reading of the prophetic reading on the new year, you danced, right? And I just thought to myself, that was such a remarkable integration of all the different pieces that you had brought into that moment.
And I would say to myself afterwards, I wouldn't do that again, you know, because it was the right moment.
It was a beautiful
It
moment.
was the right moment. We were all so scattered, but somehow on that little hill, it was.
People still talk about it, Mira. People
gosh.
still write to me and say that that was for them, for many people who came to Judaism through the body as well, or for whom art and culture, to see a rabbi dancing was quite beautiful. You're very much involved, as we said in the introduction. You helped found, very much involved in the Jews of color and bringing awareness to and celebration of the unique gifts that Jews of color bring into the Jewish community. Can you speak to that a little bit about what brought you there and Amud and other things?
While I was in rabbinical school, I knew I experienced those inequities, but I had my little world, with the people that cleaned the hallways, the people that worked in the offices who were African American or Latino. And so I had my own little, like my friend circles there. But I knew what they were doing, right? They were in service positions. But during the time I was in school, my purpose was to learn. And I remember telling myself, this work will wait. It will wait. But even when I would do my Jewish jobs, still doing at that time at B'nai Jeshurun, I was very clear, for example, about teaching our kids not only like their places, what they're supposed to do and their lines, but that if they had caregivers and the people that helped them, that supported the family who were of other races and definitely of other socioeconomic backgrounds, that we bring them into the sanctuary, and that when we have our snacks and our pizza and all this, that we offer them, and that we invite them to please not sit by where the portals are with the bitter wind coming in. And so I was very intentional about that.
Very
all
attuned to
those years,
attuned all those years,
all
attuned to
those
those
years,
who the unconscious ways that
absolutely.
people in communities are not aware of,
Right.
or institutionally or structurally ignore
Right.
margins and those who are marginalized.
Right.
Those who
Yeah, the people that bring in the elders on the
Right.
wheelchairs. So I had my own network, my own world during that time. But once I was out as a rabbi, there was a movement of suddenly of those who were Jews of color who were already working in Jewish institutions to suddenly kind of coalesce and find each other, and many nonprofits sprouted during that time. But there was a part of me that always felt like, yes, I really value and I want to dedicate a significant time of my life to grow these, but also to pass them on to the new leaders. And sometimes where a project would go would be to my liking, and sometimes it will not be to my liking, but it's like, hey, like Mira, that's the oath that you took, like, to support them in their leadership. Where they take it, hallelujah, is where they're going to take it. And somehow I found myself like seeding these things.
You've
And
always been a mentor. Like, I remember experiencing you on staff, and others have said this too, as extremely devotional and dedicated to like the community and to the staff. Like, I think that you know, at risk of saying you were like the the mothering type, but you were extremely maternal in whatever that
Yeah,
means. But like you were,
and no shame for me.
yeah,
Like
it was
no,
amazing.
yeah,
I was always inspired
yeah,
by those, how you remember to say the names of each and every person in the community that was in mourning. And there was a quality in the Roma community that became very attuned to the way that you lifted up other people. Like, there was a phrase that was in a song that you brought to the community, which was, the voice of the people is the voice of
yeah.
heaven. And that was like, there is something in you that is connected very much to community organizing, and to the voice of the community, and to those who are not seen in the community, and those who need a voice. Like, are there challenges now? I mean, I know you and I have had
Yeah.
conversations about the last, I know for me personally, as somebody who identified very much as a person in the left, progressive world, or what are the challenges now for you as a liberal rabbi, or somebody who, right, in the world of social justice and social, I guess, inequity, in terms of the last year and change? I know that you're an ardent supporter of Israel. I see you're wearing a dog tag that says, My heart is with those in Israel and the hostages." I know that I had my own struggles with some of the realizations that happened as October 7th. Are those challenges in the Jews of color community? Are they in the broader community? How are you navigating that?
Well, navigate is really,
That's the
I'm
word.
thinking of like,
Yeah.
like the gondola, with a big stick, and they're like sticking it down the ground to pull the boats forward. I started seeing a shift and kind of like staking of grounds from 2020. And already from 2020, that was the beginning of the pandemic. So like, we were all being isolated. And it was also like this eruption of anti-Black just
Animus.
sentiment and animus like all over the country, and George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and all that. And while, I was one of the rabbis that were supporting young Jews who are, supporting these issues, I remembered seeing to it's kind of like the waves parting and going in different directions. And there was a part of me that said, like, we need these spaces and these affinity groups and these like concentrated spaces for Jews of color, but we need to be in community with the rest of the Jewish world. And so there was a part of me that was like, bring back the water. So I was just like, trying, how do you navigate this current that's like just splitting us? And I would say, some people would say we're not splitting, that this is like a natural growth. And that was part of this determination, like to support Jews of color in their flowering and their growth. Sometimes it will go like anyone, like parenting. You do what you can. Sometimes it goes in this direction or in that direction, and you just hope. And I pray that our friendship, will somehow bring us back together.
Right.
And that's how I navigate it, right? So as a chaplain, I always try to reach out, and I say, if you're ready for me to reach out to you, know I'm always here. Know that you can find me. And even though I've chosen this path,
I'm
you
still
can
in
still find me.
relationships.
Yes.
Right. And
Yeah.
so for you as a chaplain, which we really,
Yeah.
really didn't have time to really delve into that, because when you became a certified chaplain, you were still at the Roma community.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, I
again
started
speaks
there. Yeah.
started there, but it speaks to your deep desire to be of service to people, especially in moments of vulnerability, and your leadership. And you are a leader. Like, it's a clear thing, whether it's through Trua, the rabbinic voice for human rights. In almost every area that you step into, you lead with powerful voice and with word, spoken word, and with your body on the line. But that value that you just expressed, the value of staying available to reconnect, even if things have diverged. So I imagine that that's put quite a bit of tension on you and on your family, all of whom were part of various communities, and that splintering that's happened since October 7th. One of the things that I often think about is, of course, Jews of color. In Israel, it's kind of funny the way sometimes funny meaning more than a bit ironic, it's slightly cynical when Jews are portrayed as this white kind of colonialist. When you
Israel,
in
it's
Israel,
not.
it's
Yeah.
Jews of color,
Yeah.
Jews from various parts of the world, whether it's from Iraq or Iran, and from Syria, from Lebanon. So the sense of that one can still be a strong supporter of Israel as our homeland, and also be on the side of indigeneity and
Right.
progressive
Right.
values. Really something that you've been on that line,
Yeah.
right?
It's my life.
It's your life.
It's my life.
It's what you live.
And I'm now being part of the Shalom Hartman Rabbinic Leadership Initiative, we've been really like examining and just really heart opening to these ideas of, how does our truth form, how does our relationship with Israel form, and our attitudes after October 7. And more I'm realizing that those experiences I
Yes.
had at the Kotel way back when were so formative for how I am. And that had the opportunity to travel in those parts of the world and to teach. I met people on the other side who really would want to find a conversation and a way to be together and be a human together. I experienced that too, but I also experienced the scary stuff.
Sure.
Like really scary stuff.
This fellowship, so the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem is a well-known think tank. It's also an educational vehicle. They have a rabbinic leadership initiative called, it's RLI, and it's a 4-year program, and you're with rabbis from all over the world who are in this highly respected, fellowship, and you're learning structures and ideas about the formation of Jewish identity. But what you did just now, which is really beautiful, is that you connected us back to that moment at the Western Wall, that remarkably fortuitous, that story sits with me so deeply, that you were a seeker, you were somebody that was, looking for something, and you were led to this moment that changed your life forever.
Forever.
That moment at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, for all seekers, Jewish, not Jewish, atheist, agnostic, whatever nationality you are, wherever you live, like the sense that somehow that app called Waze, where you have a destination and then somehow you get rerouted, but then it still helps you find your way, that you were there at the Kotel, at this Western Wall, and it gave you information that then was affirmed by Pearl Lang and affirmed by Jerry and Corman, your Italian cum German, Jewish. Amazing. It's just amazing to me. And you know what it reminds me? It reminds me of a rabbinic teaching that you know very well, which is that in the Jewish mystical tradition called Kabbalah, there is the idea that when God creates the world is unable to handle the first kind of infusion of divine light, and it shatters, kind of this notion called the shattering of the vessels. And in the Jewish mystical tradition, the shattered pieces of the original creation are called sparks. And according to the Kabbalists, the Jewish mystics, sparks are everywhere. And they're seeking to be redeemed, almost like the nutcracker. There's like within the husk or the shell, there's something that needs to be lifted up or redeemed. And in the Jewish tradition, often when we are on detours, one of the ways that the masters would reframe that would be, oh, you were there gathering sparks, right? The divine hand or whatever it might be is taking you this place to gather in the sparks that only you, uniquely you can gather in. And it sounds like you were being led to gather all of these sparks in all these different places.
My last night in Jerusalem a couple of weeks ago, I had this couple of hours. I went to visit my father-in-law's brother who was in the Rehovot, who made Aliyah. Went to visit him, and then I took a taxi. I said, "Bring me to the Kotel." And he drops me at the Jaffa gate. He doesn't know how to find, the other entrance. And so it was windy. It was so cold. And I just said, okay, go. You got to go. And I said, I'm all alone. There were so few people. And it was freezing. And somehow I made a wrong turn. And I think, from the into the Armenian quarters. And I said, you're going to find your way. Just keep following, keep going. You're going to end up at the Kotel somehow. And I did. And there were a lot of young women, and I had my list, and I found my spot in the wall. I always need to find my spot.
And I said,
I got to find a spot. And I found my spot. And I took out my list, and all these beautiful names that I had been at, Romemu, when you honored the morning minyan people, and I had all their names, and I had all these names
of
from
this
the
community that you
people
carry with you.
I carry with me, and I just said, I'm going to read them like one by one without the din and the noise of women of the wall. But I would hear the keening of the women, in cadence with my prayer. And I just remember just sitting there, like my teeth were shattering, where I just said, I have to read every single name here. And so I found my way,
You found your way.
I found my way.
I just want to ask you one last thing. This has just been so rich, and I thank you so much, Mira, for being here with us. So Mira Rivera, spiritual seeker, courageous, lover of humanity, lover of God. You're this, this bright light. You walk around in Jewish circles. I can only imagine what it's like sometimes for you to proudly stand and say, "Here's who I am." Right? I am the first Filipina American woman to ever receive ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary. I am this proud person who was a sannyasin and Varanasi. All these wonderful things about your story that you proudly stand in. And anyone who knows you knows how proudly you hold those things and how with such great dignity and inspiration for others. So I just want to ask you, because it's a scary time for a lot of us, right? A lot of us right now are in the midst of tremendous uncertainty. There seems to be change that is happening in ways that is completely overwhelming, and structures and protections that seem to be by the day, we're losing them. So how do you, like, what question are you holding for yourself right now? What's on your heart in terms of how you show up in the world at this moment, for those who might feel lost, for those who might feel like, how do we get from where we are to where we need to go? What's the wisdom that you can offer us? What are you holding? How do you show up every day?
So my methodology for me,
Yeah.
right, is I need to be situated in a place, right? So right now, I am a rabbi in residence at JCC Harlem, and just cultivating some of the relationships I've had during the time when I was still at Romemu, but that community of Romemu that was pliable and that would go out in waves into the neighboring districts, I would say, sections of New York. So keeping personal relations with different communities and widening those circles, that makes sense to me. I mean, the same way when we were in the pandemic, identifying who our neighbors were around Romemu was important to me. And I don't know any other way. There are other rabbis who will take to the bullhorn and like preach to the world. I need to keep those circles like alive and keep human faces, put human faces to all those relationships. And I feel that that's part of my mission. And I also have my other larger community, which is the Lunar Collective, weareasianjews.org. And I feel that in the Hartman cohort, I'm learning, I'm meeting more colleagues from other denominations and other ways of thinking about this work that we've said we're going to dedicate ourselves to. So that the physicality of that is something that I need. That's why I couldn't live anymore in a virtual teaching world only. The moment the doors opened,
Yeah.
I said, I'm going, we need to meet in person. So we do these services that are not broadcast out, but we creating the culture of we're going to sit together and eat together, something special, not just order, not just pizza or not just that, but something intentional. We will sit together. That's part of the work that I'm doing. It seems so elemental, but it's rooting me and it's giving me hope.
I love it. Being rooted and having hope is, I think, two qualities that we need now. So from this young girl who is born here but goes back to be part of a village in the Philippines, to this moment where you are leaning back into the power of relationships, the power of being there for one another, of not the big bullhorn and taking to the streets in that way, but a much more, I think, messy but important small ways that we can show up for one another to build a better world, to be full of hope and to create community. I just want to say thank you to you, Rabbi Mira Rivera, for your generosity in this conversation, taking us through the very interesting detours and destinations of your life. And we just want to say, blessings to you and all of your work in all the ways that you are making this a better world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you so much. Again, as I said, you are, you're Rabbi David, you're Rav, you're David, your colleague, your brother, and friend and neighbor.
I want to thank our team, our producer, Efrat Bigger, our editor, Maya Geyer, music by Shimon Smith. Thank you to the entire 92NY team and to Eden Cindy Foster. I'm your host, Rabbi David Ingber, and this is Detours and Destinations. Look forward to being together with you in our next episode.